Welcome to Podcast 83, a regular look at the news, stories, and trends related to Michigan's 83 counties from the Michigan Association of Counties.
Everyone, welcome to Podcast 83, podcast put on by the Michigan Association of Counties. We are once again joined by our government affairs team, Deena, Bosworth, Madeline, Fata, Samantha, Gibson. And today we're really going to focus on the governor's budget presentation, which occurred on February 7th, I believe, right? Yeah, so, another budget presentation, I can't remember which one it is for the governor, but as the process goes, the governor makes their presentation, then the legislature works on it for an extended amount of time, and then they come to an agreement, hopefully by July 1st, but could be really any time thereafter. And this year could be one of those years where it's after, we'll see. But let's talk about that, the governor's presentation, Deena. To start off, of course, something number one we always track is county revenue sharing, one of the top funding mechanisms for counties across the state. What did the governor's recommendation provide us in revenue sharing?
So the governor, again, as in years past, recommended a healthy increase for county revenue sharing. This year she recommended a 5% ongoing increase to our revenue sharing base, which is fantastic. In addition to that, she recommended an additional 3% for all of those that have their American Rescue Plan dollars allocated. So to me, every county has done that. So now we're looking at a recommended 8% increase to our revenue sharing for this year. Now, the 5% is just one time or ongoing. The 3% is one time. On top of that, she said another 2% one-time money to help with public safety expenses. So to attract and retain public safety officers, or put it toward any facility that may need public safety dollars. So overall, again, a 10% increase. 2 counties, just 2% of that's kind of tied up.
So let's talk a little bit about semantics here when we're talking ongoing versus one time. So last year we got an increase as well, ongoing and one time. I believe it was similar to this year's, correct?
Yes. Yeah.
So that 5% is on top of 5% last year. And, when we're all in high school or college, we learn about compounding and how good it is. So that's actually pretty, that 5% on top of 5% on top of whatever it was the year before, is we're starting to see some decent sized growth, right?
Yeah, we are starting to, but honestly, Steve, we went back and looked at where county revenue sharing was in 2001, and that was at 228 million. This year, the recommendation, including the one-time funds, is at 281. If we just kept up with inflation, we would be over $400 million for counties across the state. So I absolutely applaud the governor for greater than inflation recommended increases and trying to bring us back up. The problem is that last year we saw it was a stark contrast from what the governor recommended and the House passed to what actually got enacted. And they negotiated our increases at the last minute. And so, although it looks good right now, and it absolutely does, we have to watch it through the entire process very, very closely. Because last year, the governor recommended a significant increase. The House agreed with her. The Senate took away the public safety money. And at the end of the day, we got a 5% increase and a 2% one time for public safety. But it wasn't the 10% that the governor had recommended. So let's see if we can hold on this year. And hopefully they won't negotiate behind closed doors and we can have a say in it.
Yeah, and if you remember last year, the budget process last year was very much a slicing and dicing and projects here, projects there, and that sort of thing. We're not expecting that this year because it is not a significant, what the governor called back to normal budget. It's kind of normal budget times, not a lot of one-time funds being used and that sort of thing.
No more Christmas trees.
Yeah.
Back to reality.
And then 2 more quick questions on the 3% one time. Is that just going to be, do we know yet how do you qualify for that? Is that just, hey, we used our money, sign here and check this box and then you get it? Good.
Yep.
Keep it simple.
Yep, pretty much like that. Very easy.
And then
I'm sorry. I was just going to jump into our revenue sharing trust fund bills.
Sure.
So, just a reminder for our membership that the House passed out our revenue sharing trust fund bills last fall by a vote of 106 to 4. And now those bills sit in the Senate Finance Committee. The Senate Finance Committee chair has indicated an intention to take those bills up, which is great. But what those bills do, that's 4274 and 4275. They carve out 8% of the first 4 percentage points of the state sales tax and put it into our revenue sharing trust funds. And when that happens, then that's an automatic, like as long as the sales tax revenue is going up, more money is going into that account, and we'll be able to track with an increase in state revenue like we should be. So we're hopeful that those bills get moving. And if you get a chance to talk to your legislators while they're back home, please indicate support for the revenue sharing trust fund bill.
Yeah, great. Thanks for that update. And then, of course, the 2% for public safety purposes that was there last year. So kind of same parameters, I'm assuming, this year as last year on that.
Yeah, same parameters. It has to be used toward a public safety function. But there aren't a ton of strings attached to that, just as long as it's for public safety.
Okay, great. Let's move along to some human services line items. There are quite a few, actually, line items that had to do with human services in this budget. Sam, why don't you give us some of the highlights of what came from the governor?
Sure. Thank you, Steve. So we've discussed at length, especially on this podcast, the juvenile justice bed shortage crisis. In the executive budget recommendation, we do see some pretty significant funding suggestions to go towards resolving that bed shortage. There's 38 million to kind of reconfigure how the State Department of Health and Human Services contracts with child caring institutions. Those provide care to both foster-involved youth and justice-involved youth. And then there's several other million dedicated to implementing other juvenile justice task force recommendations, increasing staffing and programming, capital expenditures for juvenile justice facilities. So hopefully those come out in the final budget, and those are some pretty significant investments there.
Yeah, great. And also some kind of new funding, right, on the Medicaid pre-release support for inmates, before they are released. Why don't you talk to that a little bit? Because that's something that we're working on both at the state and federal level.
Yeah, we've been working very hard with the state, the Department of Health and Human Services, to allow Medicaid benefits to be reinstated for county jail inmates prior to their release. So in the governor's budget recommendation, there is just over $30 million in funding to enroll prisoners in limited Medicaid 90 days prior to their release. This is something, again, we've been working really hard to ensure both at the state level and at the federal level. We'll be at the NACO conference this weekend and early next week. And so we'll be working there with our federal legislators, other county commissioners across the country to really hone in on how important this is, how costly it is for counties. And, aside from the cost burden, there's also the rehabilitation perspective of if you're a county jail inmate, you don't have Medicaid and you're released, best of luck, right? Getting your health insurance back. So seeing the state, or at least the executive budget recommendation include funding for that is a huge step in the right direction.
Yeah, and let's quickly talk about that on the federal level, because there's really, and I know we're talking state budget, but this does work into one of our federal priorities on the inmate coverage there. There's 2 tracks for that, correct?
Yeah, so there's a few options. Right now, there are a few federal bill packages that have been introduced. It's tough to say what trajectory those have. However, there's what's called a Section 1115 reentry waiver that states can apply to within the federal government, and that would exempt counties, or county jails rather, from the Medicaid inmate exclusion policy at the federal level. And so it'd be federal dollars, federal Medicaid dollars funneling back to the counties to pay for county jail inmates' Medicaid expenses. So that combined with our state budget recommendation, I mean, we have pretty good outcomes before us here. One of those 3 options is going to pan out.
Yeah, and I know we've been working with our partners at the Community Mental Health Association or Sheriff's Association on that waiver as well, trying to encourage the department to work quickly in applying for that waiver, because obviously once you apply, then it's a long time for approval. Typically, we've seen other states do it, and the time frame that they've received a response is a year or two. So, but still would like to see that waiver going. So thanks for that. And then let's also talk a little bit about the Michigan Indigent Defense Commission and what the recommendation was there.
Yeah, so the executive budget recommendation does include full funding for the MIDC, which we know is a large cost. But our concern is, if the state were to decide, hey, we're no longer going to fully fund MIDC, that price tag's getting too big. We already have these departments in place at the local level. And if the state rescinds that funding, counties can't just say, oh, well, we're not going to operate a local indigent defense system anymore. And that cost burden is going to fall onto locals. So it's really crucial for us for that full funding to continue now and into the future with new standards, previously approved standards. And we see that in this budget recommendation.
Yeah, right. When the MIDC was created, one of the parameters of that was that the state would fully fund it. And if it didn't, we didn't really have to enact anything they recommended. But you're right. If it's tough to dismantle something once it's been going for a while. So that would be a nightmare logistically and at the local level if it does come to that. So it is good to see that it is being funded. All right, Madeline, let's talk a little bit about tipping fees. Maybe give a brief synopsis of what tipping fees are and how were they involved in this budget recommendation?
Sure. So the governor proposed a massive increase for tipping fees, which is what waste haulers pay for landfills. Right now, the current rate is 36 cents per ton, and the governor proposed an increase to $5 per ton. So that is a 1,289% increase. Governor Snyder recommended something similar back in 2018, and he wasn't able to get it across the finish line. With that increase, it would bring us up to par with other Midwestern states. Michigan is currently the lowest with tipping fees. It would then deter out-of-state dumping, which is a problem that Michigan faces, and MAC does support mechanisms to deter out-of-state waste. Ultimately, it would generate about $80 million annually. The bulk of that would be toward environmental remediation and brownfield redevelopment. A smaller chunk of that would go toward locals to help with recycling initiatives, and an even smaller chunk of that would go to landfill operations.
So when you're talking environmental remediation efforts, is that through Eagle? So the majority of those fees would go to Eagle for those purposes, in the brownfield purposes as well? Okay. All right, great. And then also anything on road funding in this budget? Any changes or for anything for local roads?
The transportation budget was pretty unexciting this time around. There is overall a 2.3% increase, but that's all Act 51 dollars. That's not any new money. We're going to see the last installment of the governor's bond, $700 million, but kind of boring on that front.
Yeah, so no increases to any other fees, anything like that in this budget?
No.
Okay. All right, great. I think that covered the majority of the topics we were looking to cover, unless anyone had anything else they wanted to add in. No? Seeing a lot of heads.
Well, there were a couple things. Just this is for Stan Ponstein. Governor recommended $25 million for Pure Michigan. Stan, so if you're listening to the podcast, thank you very much. You always ask me what's going on with Pure Michigan. Another $25 million. Not really an increase, but flat from the year before. And then a little bit of money was put in there out of that remediation fund, I think, for stormwater management, which we were pretty excited about. I guess I just want to say overall, this budget recommendation was pretty good. It recognized a lot of our priorities that we have. So revenue sharing for sure, even though it's not the trust fund, but it's still a hefty increase. The Medicaid for those incarcerated individuals who for pre-release. That was a huge MAC priority, so we're very happy about that. So I think overall, good budget recommendation for us.
Well, that's good. And we still got, you mentioned the revenue sharing bills that are separate policy, budget bills that are coming through. We've got a trial court funding sunset coming up we'll be working on. So still things outside the budget, a lot of things outside the budget we'll be working on over the next few months as, we work through this budget process and the legislature. So thanks, everyone. I appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to today's episode of Podcast 83.